inner engineering. For those who have had a chance to start the first part or read the first part, what was like an overall, maybe overarching thought or theme that you thought that was relevant, or something that you found maybe pretty impactful? If you found something impactful, I'd love to hear. One of the first ones that came up was about the body and like who we are, as like who you are basically. And he says, who you are is not the sum total of accumulations you have made. And he speaks of how, you know, your body is basically just an accumulation of the food that you eat. This, of course, is really, really interesting scientifically and physically. Obviously, it is the truth. But when you think about it, it's really interesting to me, at least, is that like everything that we eat literally becomes us. And I don't often think that we give it enough thought. And that our mind is basically a sum total of the accumulations of the impressions that we receive via our senses. So he says that what you accumulate can be yours, but it can never be you. And he basically says that after all that you are not your accumulations, like everything that you've accumulated via the external environment, so via nature. You are not any of those things. You are basically everything that is not. So it was for me, it was I liked the way that he was explaining it, because it was very tangible for me, at least, and a way to understand, because I find that sometimes, at least for me, it can be difficult for people to know what this like self is, or what the essence of our being is. And it can be difficult for people to kind of like grasp, well, who am I? And we often think that we are our thoughts, or we are our mind, and get all entangled and not really aware of that. So I liked his way of kind of explaining everything that we are not, and then saying that we are what we like, we are what lies beneath all those things that we aren't. So that was one thing that I liked. So for those who have just joined in the last couple minutes, I just asked to hear from anyone who'd like to share what was in this first chapter, or from what you read so far, or the first few chapters rather. What was like the most like overarching theme that you thought was relevant, or like a specific topic that you thought was relevant, or something that you found rather interesting for you personally?
I'll just jump in then. I thought I just really like the way that he treats language to explain things. And one of the first things that I sort of stumbled on was the responsibility, and the way he breaks it down into your ability to respond. And I literally never ever thought about that word in that way. So I was just, so many times when I've been reading this book, I've had to go back and reread the sentence that I just read, to just like mull it over and be like, oh, that is just like completely, it's the same thing. It's not new, but it's a new way of looking at it that I've never done. And that's, yeah, it took me a lot longer to read than it normally does, because I kept having to do that and go back. And then even when I understood what he was saying, and he came to like some analogy that he was using to explain it, like, I don't know if it was the man that was dying in the street and is it your responsibility? And I'd be like, oh no, wait, it is. And like, when you look at it that way, then of course I understand, but it's just my gut reaction would be like what I always been. And then I'm like, oh, I know, it's a different way of looking at it. And it's a rare gift to be able to do that, I think. So yeah, that's one thing.
Yeah. So you mean his way to like kind of explain and underline those ideas that he's trying to convey?
Yeah, because to me, taking that word, it's I find that hard. Like I always find it like it's a word filled with, it's heavy. You know, you put responsibility on something or somebody, and it's something that you carry. But when he talks about it, it's like a gift, not something that like brings you down. And it's a lot of other things that he uses the same perception, turnaround of perception, that something that you might consider to be a hardship or a burden is actually the other way around. And it's the way he speaks about responsibility as being freedom rather than not freedom was, not mind blowing, but also in a way mind blowing, because I don't think that that's how most people see that. Being like, oh, I have so many responsibilities, I have so many things to do, and I can't do this because I have so many responsibilities. And he goes, well, no, actually, you have all the choice in the world because you have responsibility. And that's, yeah, that was something that stayed with me for a long time when I read it.
Yeah. That's it's so funny you mentioned that, Liz, because it's literally exactly what I said in the last meeting too, the one that we had this morning for the other time zone. So it's so funny to hear somebody else get that from it too. I was like you, it's like, we use this word regularly, at least, in the English language and probably in other languages, a variation of, and we use it in this sort of like constricting context where it's like, oh, I have to do this thing and like this is my responsibility, instead of your like ability to respond, and looking at it more like empowering, and like I am able to do this thing, or I am able to choose how I respond to this situation. It's a whole new way of looking at everything that we consider a responsibility, or like everything even within life is like we have the responsibility to like go to work, and responsibilities in our lives, and instead of looking them as sort of these, yeah, things that we are required to do and maybe not fitting within our desires, it's like, no, we are able to respond to these situations in a way that of our choosing, and it's not forced upon us. It's literally our entire lives are created by us. So yeah.
Okay. So I started my yoga training backwards. Like I was able, because of my background with the counseling and the Pilates, they allowed me to do yin training and prenatal and postnatal yoga too, because I have prenatal, postnatal Pilates. So it's only now I'm actually finishing my 200 hour with Selena Garifino and with the Himalayan Institute. So this brings it all back to all the philosophy I'm learning right now, the Samkhya. So everything, like when he talks about, yoga is a mix of your intellect, karma, energy, devotion, bhakti, all those things. And so chapter one, it's just about the body, and meditation, this whole concept of detachment, because even in the detachment, like everybody now is into mindfulness and meditation, it's still a goal. And even the concept of detachment is still a goal. So it's still not the real detachment that they talk about. So it was nice. It sort of like everything I'm reading now connects again, reconnects. And so what he talks about, yeah, like in chapter one. So just
Yeah. Yeah, the first chapter, he was talking a lot about like what is like within our abilities and within our human experience, and how, like, is basically us and what we are not. And it's so relevant. Like I agree with what Liz, you said before too, is that like it's one of those books that I don't think is necessarily like page turner where you just go through like, and because a lot can be lost that way. It's a book that you do have to read sentences over and over and over again, and it's not because it's extremely um ancient English language or something that's like difficult, but it's like, wait a second, what is he trying to say here? And you have to really like go through it and understand it on more like a deeper level, an experiential level almost. And that's what I love about stories that he incorporates with them too, is that even if you aren't necessarily grasping the concepts right away, he gives a story to explain it, like the story with the worms and the fishing. I was like, before I read the story, I was like, okay, what is this concept he's trying to say? And then he explains the story. I was like, okay. It's like you can do everything that is at it that you think is right. So you can go out to the wherever fishing area, and you can have your rod and you can have your worms and you can spend hours and hours there and you can be in the right spot. But if you aren't incorporating all of the necessary things, you're not going to get any results. And it was like something so simple as just worming the worms in order to catch the fish. That was what was needed to actually achieve the results. So yeah, it's nice that he's able to, or I thought it was nice that he's able to kind of like relate different digestible stories to the concepts that might otherwise be a little more esoteric, or like little more difficult for a lay person to read, especially, or understand, like especially if it's their first book of the type, outside of a yoga teacher training or anything like that. It's kind of, it can be an undertaking, I think. So one of the things he said was mastery over your body will give you the ability to have 15 to 20% of your life and your destiny within your control or in your hands. Mastery over your mind will give you 50 to 60%. And mastery over your life energies will give you 100%. So of your life and your destiny to be like in your own hands. And this is going back to that responsibility again. It was interesting how he like brought it all the way to like already life energies. I did find that it was quite early on to bring that up. But for me, I saw it a lot as kind of like a path, and similar to like the Ashtanga 8-limb path, how it's although the order is a little bit different, I guess, how it's like, okay, yes, working on your body is important, and whether that's like physically through asana practice, but it's only going to give you like a small percentage of your ability to like control your experience of your life and your destiny. And then going to the mastery of the mind into more meditative practices gives you 50 to 60%, which still is huge, I think, on a like if we look at our global species, the scale, I think if 50 to 60% of our population had that much control over themselves, we'd be in a much different world. But and then going further into the life energies and having 100%. So I thought that was an interesting kind of breakdown, and whether or not it was just a example with numbers to like give you an idea. I thought it was an interesting point for him to make. So any thoughts on that breakdown of having control over or mastery over your body, your mind, and your energies?
I will say something. So I listened to this book 3 years ago as an audio book, and now I'm very glad that I had the chance to read it. But I read it in German, and sometimes it's difficult for me to catch up with you talking about it in the English language, and it takes me some time to form my thoughts in words.
Yeah, of course.
But I'm just so glad to really had the chance to read the book, and I find this aspect about the 15%. I cannot find it now where it is written in the book, and then the huge step with the meditation and coming inside, but then the life energies. And I remember when I heard this first with the audiobook, I was like, oh, with the body it's only 10 to 15%. It's so little, and so many people think that it's like everything. Yeah. And what I really appreciate, I also appreciate how he writes and how he tells the stories, but there are so often sentences like even when you start yoga and it's because of the wrong reasons, it's right. It's right. And this is something I really want to keep in mind for myself always, but also for all the people I'm teaching. Yeah, even if they just want to become more flexible in one part of the body, if they are there and then they have reached like the 15% in this certain point or in their lives, then maybe they will go beyond. Yeah, and then after that again beyond. And yeah, I really liked it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was actually something that I wrote down as well. So it literally exactly that. Even if you go into yoga for the wrong reasons, it still works. And I loved that. And obviously it was something that resonated with me as well, because oftentimes I do kind of like think that, well, you know, so many people need to know that yoga is more than asana. And, you know, especially people outside of the yoga community, it's like everybody thinks that it's just stretching and, you know, it's just so many people are not really aware of just how much it encompasses. Even if they are in the yoga world, there's still a lot of confusion around that. So it was helpful for me because it's like, yeah, even if people are in it, and I don't even know if it's like a wrong reason, but it's of course our interpretation of it. And so even if they are in it for the wrong reasons, it still works. And I thought that was extremely important for me, and it resonated as well.
Going back to what you were asking about when he's talking about you know, the yogic science, the whole thing of the technology and how, so when you're reading it, and if you're in this whole yogic mood, then it's easy to say yes, yes, I agree. But then even when I was thinking about it, how can we actually like choose our moment of death, right? When he says, when you take everything 100% into your own hands, like theoretically and reading it, it's so easy. And then, but when you come back to the realities of our life, just like now, even with like COVID, you know, the fear that comes in, it's easy to say, let it go. Like I tell people, let it go. Don't be fearful. It'll add to your lack of longevity in that sense, right? You're creating toxicity for yourself. But at the same time, it's a reality. So you can't also like poo-poo people's perceptions of reality, right? And then you come from different approaches, even religion-wise. I'm in a very Catholic country where everything is predetermined to some degree. With, you know, like supposedly Catholicism has room for choice, but even within that choice, supposedly God already gave you the road. You just choose left or right, but everything is predetermined. So in that sense, I understood it philosophically, but I did not feel it internally, and I still don't, even now that I take my classes, you know, about Patanjali and Samkhya and all this. So on the academic philosophical side, I enjoy it, but applying it to my personal life, I'm not there. You know, I'm still very much with the Gnostic Gospels. I love Saint John of the Cross, those kind of things, Aquinas. So I don't believe too much in the whole Hindu philosophical aspect of yoga. So, yeah.
So what specific aspects do you find the most like outside of your, I mean, not intellectual ability to understand, because obviously you understand it, but your ability to like apply it or live it?
I have an older sister, and she's very much into, that's how I got also involved in yoga. She was in San Francisco way before I was, and she was into that whole wearing purple crystals, you know, hanging out at the Sivanand ashram and everything. But like, she has no children, married late, and even her kind of work she takes up and leaves whenever she wants. And even when every time I'd get stressed and she'll tell me detach, 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 my example would always be, come over here and I'll kick you in the shins and tell me if it hurts. So yes, if you were that Buddha under the tree and you let go, and we have similar stories in Catholicism. You had Christ, you had Saint Francis, they gave up everything, but the village fed them. So yes, they were detached, but everybody else around them took care of them. So in that sense, the detachment is, if you detach, things will fall into place. You'll be taken care of anyway. But what happens when you have children? So mine always goes back to that, you know, like when you have children, how do you practice this whole thing of detachment? How do you say that, you know, like everything is created by you, that all the problems you create, most of it unconsciously, even though you think it's being heaped on you, right? But sometimes it is being heaped on you. In this modern industrial life, we're no longer living that purest life of being, you know, one with the land and working it and living and dying in the same place. So that's where I don't find the reconciliation with a lot of these old philosophies, you know, whether it be even in the Christian tradition or Hindu or even Buddhist traditions.
Yeah, that you know, there's always those examples that are really, it's what really brings the challenge to these concepts, is when you have things like, you know, even if we go into, you know, you mentioned having children, or say a loved one passes away or gets seriously ill, and all of a sudden you turn to somebody and say, well, you know, I know your Auntie Jemima passed away, but you're in control of how you respond to it, so therefore you shouldn't suffer. And that's where, I mean, that's a little bit to me like what we call this new term, spiritual bypassing. And so I get there, like, is totally a really fine line between having the compassion for the individual, and whether that's you or your, you know, somebody, you're a friend, an acquaintance, somebody who's telling you this situation, there's definitely an element of compassion that is needed. And but I think it's more about like, of course, everything that happens external to us is not within our control. If we think that we can control the external environment, well, that's what causes suffering. But to me, the overarching theme of this is that it's not about what happens externally. It's about understanding that everything that is internal is within our control. And he said, creating your own destiny is about steadily heading toward your well-being and your ultimate nature, no matter what the content of life is around you. So, and again, it's a little bit maybe heavy if we're looking at words like destiny and heading toward your ultimate nature. It can be a little bit less easy to grasp, but how I interpret that is more along the lines of like, no matter what happens around you, if you stay connected to like the essence of who you are and the essence of your being, and being aware that you are not everything that's external to you, and not even your thoughts and not even your physical body, then you are able to more easily stay on this path. So it's kind of like this this wheel where it's like, if you're able to head in this direction, then you're able to stay on the path, and if you stay on the path, then you're able to stay on the direction. It's like, yeah, and the more you're kind of like in this cycle, it's the more that everything around you doesn't affect you. And it's not to say that, of course, like something serious happens that you can't respond, but it's having that that authority and that ability, when we look at response ability to respond to the situation and taking that on as our own ability, that becomes what I feel like is empowering, to know that I am able to respond in a way that I choose, as opposed to having the outside world dictate how I feel, what's going on in my head, like where my thoughts are, what my body's doing. If we're looking at what is outside of us as affecting us, or if we're living as kind of a victim to, not victim, but if we're living as a consequence of what happens around us, then it's a lot different than having that ability to respond. So that's my interpretation of it, at least.
That sort of is the like one day at a time, you know, like in addiction counseling, they love to use that, people coming from 12 steps one day at a time, but even that is like misunderstood in the sense that they think they shouldn't have any plans going forward. But the way a lot of us therapists see it is, no, you have a life plan, but when you wake up the next morning and the car doesn't start, you can't get to work, don't have a cow. In that sense, you take each one, and it shows, yeah, how resilient you are. It shows yeah, your inner engineering, you know, just the kind of person you are. But some of the deeper philosophical aspects, like even one, you can choose the womb you're born into. And I said that to my children. One of them said, I don't think I had a choice in this one. I feel like joking around. Like, really, Mom, we chose you? I go, you better wonder why. So I know it's like a deeper philosophical aspect, but yeah, I still have like hard times with it, and reconciling it still, yeah, with a lot of my own philosophical upbringings of the religion that I belong to, which I also move away from. So sometimes it's hard when you dabble with too many, then you try to fit them in, and then they cross over and they negate each other. So sometimes too much learning is really not a good thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's the intellectual pursuit of it, and then there is a point. I can't even remember where I read it now. I think it's in one of the copies of the Bhagavad Gita, where they talk about, like, you know, it comes to a point where reading and studying is too much, and you need to start experiencing. And so it's like, you know, if you're reading a book a day, sort of thing, not me, but like if you're reading, it comes to a point where that can even be too much. And you need to actually go out and live and experience these concepts so that they become wisdom, as opposed to just this like superficial intellectual knowledge. And one quote that I really, really liked as well, that I heard recently, was that just because you are aware of something doesn't mean that it has. And so, for instance, like, just because you're aware that being in the present moment is better than living in the future, living in the past, doesn't mean that you're not going to have times when you aren't living in the present moment. Right? So, yeah, I think that's taking all of these different ideas comes to a point in our journey when it's like, okay, I've read a little bit about this and a little bit about this and a little bit about this, and I know a overview of what these different topics are. Now I need to experience them and see what sits with me and what speaks true to me, because it's not going to be the same for everyone. And that's, I think, is really beautiful, that there are these different paths, and it's a way that we can find what is best for us.
I love the book, and I really like the fact that it gives concrete example, but still makes it very difficult for me to bring it into the outside world. It's like I can intellectually kind of grasp the concept. I can even feel it in like the energy, the self behind the mind and the thought and the experience that we have in life. If I'm in meditation for 1 hour, then I'm like, okay, I get what you mean. Like I'm feeling it. But as soon as I get out in the world, most of the time I will be reactive and responsive. And so it's like either I need to like get out of the situation. I was like, I'm gonna meditate. I'm sorry. Like I need to like process what's happening before I'm able to respond. And that's still, and I'm guessing it's working little by little. I'm guessing I'm way less responsive now than what I used to be before starting the journey. But still, I'm like having a really hard time to build the bridge in between. Okay, when I'm alone and I'm withdrawing from like the five senses and I'm connecting more to myself, like that I can get, but not losing this connection with myself. When I have all of the stimuli from the outside and all of these things happening, like that's still something that for me doesn't say in the book. And probably you cannot explain it, and that's why it's not in the book. But if anyone has like some advice, or like how do you stay connected moment to moment when you're actually around, like out there in the world?
Well, if you haven't read part 2 yet, you're going to be pleasantly surprised because you haven't read it yet.
I did. I've read it already, and
oh, okay. You still did you try the practices?
I tried some, and it does help.
Mm.
But most of the time when I'm interacting with other people, that's when things get tough.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, that's to me is super interesting that is how most of us are, and it's really like, thank you for sharing that, because that's a vulnerable share, that it is like it is so common, that all of us experience, or majority of us are experiencing exactly that is, and myself included. It's like you get put into these situations where you can have all the tools, but then all of a sudden it's like there's a lock on the toolbox, and all of a sudden you're reverting to old patterns, and you're doing what you were doing 10 years ago, or you're reacting how you'd react 10 years ago. And it's like for me, the more charged the situation is, like the more energetically charged, and the less energy I have. So, if I'm not feeling so well, or if I'm lack of sleep, or if I haven't done my practice for the day, it's like my ability to stay present and my ability to stay in like the responsibility, non-reactive way is so much more diminished when I'm not fully charged, and when I'm not my like best self. I find that is definitely way more challenging, and that's why I speak of basically my whole day-to-day life is my yoga, is my practice, like my every interaction with people, and my like reading about yoga is self-study, and taking those nuggets of insights and applying them is yoga, and then being in situations and not reacting is yoga. So like I just try and look at it that way. So I don't know if it's definitely not a tip of how to stay present, but I look at it more as that's the part of the practice, and that's part of learning. And I do notice, at least for me personally, is that the time that I become aware of my inability to stay in the present moment, or if I am becoming reactive, that like lag time between when I become aware of it is decreasing. over time. So it's like, instead of the next day I realize, oh man, I really messed up yesterday, it's like, oh, 5 minutes later, oh shoot, now I was being really reactive. So that's a win to me, is that lag time is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So then like maybe one day it'll be matched up with the actual present moment. I think, because at least that's like the trajectory.
I'm hoping that as well, because when I'm surrounded with difficult situation, I increase my amount of asana practice, my amount of meditations. Like the more I'm feeling not so good in the outside world, the more I go in as a way to like recharge and be whole again, and then be better when I go back in the world. I'm hoping that at some point I won't need to, when I'm feeling bad, to like meditate 2 hours a day and do 2 hours of asanas. And depending on what's happening in my life at the moment, and to have like this being almost inside of me at all times without having to say, okay, I need to withdraw and go on the mat and meditate. I'm hoping that's the whole process, is be like, okay, I have this inner wisdom with me at all times, and I don't need to withdraw from the world.
Yeah, I mean, you already, like, you know it's there, you know, like intellectually you know it's there, right? It's just having it become more and more accessible on a like a quicker, over a quicker amount of time. So like with less lag time in between. And it have you read I think it was Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself?
No.
By Joe Dispenza?
No. I'm taking notes.
Has anyone else read that? Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself? Yeah, Julia. So I believe it's in that book he talks about, and it's in a couple of these. Oh, it's also in The Brain That Changes Itself by Dr. Norman Doidge, I think his name is Doidge. Has anyone read that one? No? Okay. So these are really, really interesting books that are very similar in that they talk about how our neurological programming is. So they're both like from a neuroscience background, and they talk about how like our how we react in situations is basically like if you imagine skiing down a ski slope, and you know, or you know, you can imagine, even if you haven't ever skied before, how the more times you go down the same path, the deeper and deeper the grooves go, right? And so when you are trying to change that path, but you know, you're going down a hill and all of a sudden you're trying to change the direction, it's difficult. It's difficult to get out of those grooves. And you know, sometimes you wobble, and sometimes, you know, you may even fall over, you may tumble and do a somersault and then get up and get back and try again. But the more you do it and the more you come off of that patterned programming, the deeper those new get. And the more that becomes habitual, and the more that becomes an established pattern, as opposed to like that old patterning. So that's how the reprogramming works. It's like, it's really clumsy and it takes a long time, and it doesn't necessarily feel so great the first few times, but the more you do it, the more regular habit it becomes, the easier it gets and the more established. And then that just becomes your new pattern. So again, going back to this like responsibility versus reactivity, he said reactivity is enslavement and responsibility is freedom, which I think can be a way for, at least I could see it as a way for me to help people who are maybe in a situation where they're becoming really reactive and don't necessarily understand these concepts, to explain it, in that if you're constantly just reacting and in ways that are dictated by your external environment, then you're trapped and you're literally enslaved by your external experiences, versus when you become personally responsible for yourself, it's literally liberating, and that is freedom. So I really liked that simple, two statements, like 6 words in total. Reactivity is enslavement, responsibility is freedom, as a way of kind of like summing up that overarching theme of our ability to respond to situations. And then one other thing I had that I did talk about with the last group, but I wanted to hear from perhaps you, is in the last part, I think it was called No Boundary, No Burden, or whatever the last section was. Maybe that was your body section, but he talked about 4 different types of yoga. He talked about karma, jnana, bhakti, and kriya yoga. And for me, it was the first time I'd really heard them combined in this way, as speaking to karma yoga being the yoga of action, of course, jnana yoga being the yoga of wisdom, bhakti yoga being the yoga of devotion, and kriya yoga being the yoga of energies, or transforming energies, is what he referred to it as. And it just differed slightly from my understanding of kriya yoga. So I was wondering what your thoughts were, or if you'd given it much thought, or if you have any ideas about kriya yoga.
I heard about it, and for some reason it keeps popping up in my Facebook like an ad for Kriya Yoga, but I've tried to understand. I think there's like some what that was, like the advertisement was, because I looked it up. I was like, because I didn't know what it was, and in that context, it seemed to be something very set, sort of like Ashtanga. Like Kriya Yoga is this set of asanas or way of doing, but so I've never heard it described in the way it is here. That wasn't really an answer, but it's, yeah, my answer is I don't really know.
Yeah, you know what though? This was my exact place where I was like not long ago, where I was like, what the heck? I'm hearing of all this Kriya Yoga and I don't understand exactly what it is. And well, I feel like the more I read about it, or the more I hear about it, the less I understand sometimes. Baby said that there's a course offered here by Isha Group, and you do it in Kundalini. So that I know is that there's Kriyas in Kundalini, right? Like you do Kriyas as part of the Kundalini practice, correct?
You do the Kriya together with the breath and together with a certain type of asana. So that's the whole Kriya Yoga. There has to be combination of the pranayama with the mudra and the mantra.
Yeah. So that's one aspect of it, I guess, that comes from the Kundalini tradition. Have you read the autobiography of a yogi? So has anyone read Autobiography of a Yogi? It's not high on my list of recommendations. It is an interesting book, but it is, I had to read it a couple times. Like if you think inner engineering was like, the concepts were a little bit difficult, he just speaks in a way that is not, I don't know. I don't even know how to classify his way of speaking, but it's something that if English is not your first language, it is not an easy undertaking. But he speaks of Kriya Yoga, and that's the yoga that he practices. And this book, I think, is probably it's from, I think, the 70s, so like 50 years old. 1916. The Autobiography of Yogi is 1916.
Sorry, the exercise is developed by Yogananda.
Yeah, Paramahansa Yogananda. G.
2016 that he made the different energizing exercises. Yeah.
Okay. So in that book, he talks about like Kriya Yoga, and I was like, okay, great, finally I'm going to learn what Kriya Yoga is. Did not understand by the end of the book. So what I ended up understanding about it is that it's not one specific, it's not like Ashtanga, it's not like Bikram or any of these like set sequences of asanas. And the reason that it is so poorly understood is because it's one of those more protected forms of asana forms of yoga, not just asana, where it is not just openly taught to a group of people as just this like broad, this is how you do yoga, you do this thing and then you breathe this way and then you do these mudras. It's individual to the practitioner. So it's not something that can be taught in a group class setting. At least traditionally, that wasn't the idea behind it, was that it was meant to be passed from teacher to student in an individual relationship. That teacher would give the student the kriyas for them to practice specifically that would help them to achieve their yoga. And then, yeah, I know in Kundalini they do, the kriyas are with asana, mudra, pranayama, right? And in the autobiography of a yogi, he speaks of his kriya yoga consisting of tapas, svadhyaya, and ishvara pranidhana, which are, if you know the yamas and niyamas, that's where they come from. And so you have tapas, which is the austerity, svadhyaya, which is the self-inquiry, self-study, and then ishvara pranidhana, which is surrendering to the universe, or like walking in awareness of the ultimate reality. So if we look at those, then I read another explanation of these, which was related back to, so we have tapas, which is like that burning desire, that burning passion. So tapas was related to asana. Svadhyaya, the self-study, was related to jnana yoga, and Ishvara pranidhana was related to bhakti. So now we're going back to those three that were already spoken of, karma, jnana, and bhakti, and those being encompassed by this term kriya yoga. So yeah, that's I know that that's not an answer, but that was just well, it was my question anyways, but obviously I'm not answering it. But that was I guess I'm no clearer on what exactly, like I understand that how he related them to the different ways of practicing yoga to affect our body, to affect our mind, to affect our emotions, and to affect our energies. Like I understood all that, but I guess for me it was like I liked how he talked about, finally, this was in one of the stories that I really liked, how he talked about these four practitioners of these four types of yoga, and how like they were all doing their own thing and they were all certain their path was perfect. And then all of a sudden a big rainstorm comes and they go into the cave and they get all together around this deity or whatever it was. And as soon as they come all together, God appears and they say, "Why didn't you come before?" And he says, "Well, you idiots never got all together before." And it was like, I don't think he said idiots, but something like that, where it was like, it took you guys this long to actually get together, and each one of you thought you knew the best way and your way was the only way. And it took you actually coming all together to finally realize whatever it is, like self-realization or God realization, whatever you want to consider it. So I think that's something that page is something I'm going to have to go back to again and again and again, at least for me, and kind of go over it and understand exactly what his lesson is there, because it's like, yeah, okay, so am I just practicing all of, and maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's as simple as that. Is just practicing all of these things, and then one day I'll become enlightened. Maybe. That's not the goal. Yeah. Sorry, I know I just like talked through a bunch of stuff in my head, but as I was talking, I was like, maybe that's what he was saying finally. But it was I wrote all these questions like, is this not the mind, and is this not for the body, and are they not related? And then thinking about that story, I'm like, oh, maybe that's what he was saying, is that they are all related, and there is no one best path or one best way. And we need to kind of incorporate everything. And maybe that's going back maybe to what you were talking about with like taking little bits from everywhere. And it's not necessarily that one person's like prescribed path is the best thing for you. And it's not necessarily that there's one, just because the Buddha got enlightened by sitting under a tree until he was enlightened doesn't mean that's going to work for everyone, right? So maybe that was the lesson there, was that it's not that there's one right way for everyone, but it's just practicing these different forms that help us to get clearer.
Yes, I mean, I really like the story because I feel like a lot of times, depending on what yoga certain people practice, they really are not open-minded. They're like, well, this is the right way, at least for me, and I'm not even gonna give it a chance with others. And they're staying on this, in this box more. And most of the time we are teaching though to stay open-minded, but a lot of times maybe we don't because we're like, well, this is only gonna work, and I tried a different style of yoga or meditation or whatever it might be before, and it didn't work for me. But it can also mean maybe that was not the right moment. And first of all, yes, you need to stay within your yoga style, but then once in a while give it another chance with other practices to maybe see, oh, maybe now the time has arrived. First I had to walk this path, but now I can turn and include something else into my life, or continue with my journey to then bring everything together in the end. And for me, the message was like, stay open-minded and don't just think this is the right way. And also don't teach that to others. Like, feel free to try other things. Maybe this is not for you, but I won't be mad if you're not coming to my class, or, things like that, or you have a different opinion. I think also maybe, like you were saying before, by joining with other people as well, you keep on getting new input as well, and you continue learning. Because if you just surround yourself with, for me right now, it's the yin yoga, how I start, and I did my teacher training in that, but I am interested in other yoga styles to get more knowledge about that. I do have certain knowledge, but not a lot. But at one point, maybe next year, I will do the next teacher training more for hatha yoga or something like that. But at this time, it's gonna be too much information, like we were saying earlier as well. No, you have to start with something, otherwise there's gonna be like an overflow and little pieces of everything. But you need to kind of, I think, in my opinion, first let it settle. Don't read a book a day, but practice. And then when you're ready, then you can go the next step. And yes, like I said, stay open-minded and have an exchange with other people who might have different opinions.
No, I think that's really, really an important point, and something that is probably overlooked, and kind of even just that term open-minded is diluted, I think, more way more than it should be, and it's not given the weight that it deserves. We use it so regularly, at least I hear it very regularly, about, oh, be more open-minded, be more open-minded, but it's like, then we turn around and do the opposite thing, like Laura, you were talking about. It's like you know to be open-minded, but then I also know from my experience that this is the best way, so this is the way that it should be done. And it's like we forget almost in the moment that it's to open our mind to other possibilities. So I think, yeah, that's that word should have much more weight to it than it does, and it's so important yet so difficult to do regularly and to have as a part of our regular practice and our everyday interactions and our life, is to really truly be open-minded on a regular basis about things.
And like you were saying too, okay, we are trying to be open-minded, but do the opposite instead of like thinking, oh yeah, you continue doing your thing, but you know, whatever. And instead of doing that, maybe ask questions. So why is it that you have chosen this way? What do you feel? What are your thoughts about it? To actually be open-minded in that moment by asking the questions instead of just saying, okay, I accept your opinion, I see it differently, but to go further into the topic, maybe to really learn.
Yeah, definitely. Instead of just kind of like washing over it and saying, yeah, I'm open-minded. It's like, well, are you open-minded, or are you being ignorant and refusing to look at this part of it? There's a fine line.
Yeah, the thing is like, it's trying new things for the first time, but also trying something that you've tried before, but again, because I took a note about that, and it was like, when the conditions are right, when an insight is articulated from a place of inner clarity, and when it meets the reader at the right moment of receptivity, and age-old truths turn explosively alchemical, and all of a sudden it's fresh, alive, radiantly new, as if uttered and heard for the first time in history. And that happened to me, and I think that happens to all of us. Like, yeah, we tried it, and it was like, yeah, that's not for me. And then you think because you've tried it once and it wasn't for you, you have explored that way and you don't have to go back again. But if you do give it another go on another moment of life, you may be in the right condition this time and be more open to it. And then you'll be like, oh, it's like, I've never heard that before, even though you did, but you weren't just receptive enough to really grasp what it was about. So that's something that, like, okay, from time to time, I kind of like go back to things that I've tried and discarded, because maybe it was not that thing that wasn't for me. It was just that I wasn't in the right condition at that time.
Definitely. Yeah. I've learned, as you said, you illustrated and explained perfectly. I know I've learned that and continue to learn that, is that when I think that something is definitely not for me, and then all of a sudden something changes, conditions change, I change, all of a sudden maybe this is for me. So my own personal philosophy, and maybe this is how how I embrace open-mindedness, is that I'll always try something, like within reason, okay, but I'll try something at least 3 times, and not like one after the other, and that's everything from like, a specific yoga class to a specific activity to a different technique, like a meditation technique or something. It's like, just because it doesn't work when I first try it doesn't mean that I write it off forever, because I have experienced time and time and time and time again that situations change, I change, and what worked for me before might not work any longer, or vice versa. what didn't work might be what I need right now. So yeah, I think that is, you know, it's, again, to me, that's all part of the practice. That's all yoga is, just knowing that and being aware of that and staying open, and willing to. One of the really interesting things is that I there's a girl called Jules Mitchell, if you haven't heard of her, or a woman, Jules Mitchell, who she's a yoga teacher, and she also wrote the book, so many books, Yoga Biomechanics. So it's like totally not anything to do with like yoga philosophy. It's obviously biomechanics, so it's more like on the physical level. But she mentioned at one point in there that if there's anything she's learned over her 20, I think, plus years of teaching, and she's also I think physiotherapist or physical therapist, something. She, a very, very, very smart woman. If there's anything she's learned, she said it's that there's so much in admitting when something you previously thought is no longer true for you. And she says that this is something that she's observed over and over and over again, is that what she thought maybe was correct or right in the past changes. And only those who refuse to be open to this ability for things to change, or for ability for your own opinions to change, if you refuse for that to happen, or you don't let it happen, that's when you don't evolve, and that's when you stay stagnant. But if you're able to say, and she's talking a lot about like specific alignment things, but for me it was so much more than that. And it was like, yeah, you know, we need to be able to admit that what worked for me before, not that it wasn't true at that point, but it's no longer what works for me. And so if we just stick to doing that thing because it's what we know and it's what we've always done, then we're hindering our own progress and our own evolution, as opposed to saying, you know what, it's okay that this is now different and this is now changed, and maybe I don't like to practice vinyasa yoga anymore, or you know, this type of meditation technique anymore, just because you always have, and just because it worked for you before doesn't mean it's what you need right now. And yeah, so it was I think that it was important for me to hear that from someone that was like outside of a kind of like philosophical aspect, and more in it was more related to like how she teaches and how she cues, and her ideas even around the physical body. And you know, if we look at science, even, it's constantly changing, and only people who are stuck in studies that were done 30, 40 years ago, and but just because they found these results back then doesn't mean there aren't more updated studies finding new information that's more relevant than that. And that gives you more insights and more information and more conclusions to draw, than what is outdated information from 30, 40, 50, hundreds of years ago. So that's, yeah, that was a point that I think that was very good for me to understand, and maybe relevant to this, is that, you know, just because it works right now, or just because it didn't work before, doesn't mean that it's never going to work, or it's not something that it like doesn't mean you have to discard it completely. Basically, just put it on the back burner. And like you said, it's like, because it's in there somewhere in your past, and then all of a sudden if you come across it again and it's like this big aha moment, it's like, oh, I always knew this, and then all of a sudden it's like resonance on a whole new level, because now it's what you need. All right, anyone else, anything else to add or any other things you wanted to bring up? Okay, so we will do the next part next month. Thank you all for joining. Thanks for this lovely chat. Have a beautiful day.